I have often wondered what Gnosticism really is, so I'm delighted to have had a conversation with Miguel Connor, who has the answer. Keep watching to learn more.
Book 3 in the new Thinking Aloud dialogue series is UFOs and UAP, Are We Really Alone? Now available on Amazon.
New Thinking Aloud is presented by the California Institute for Human Science, a fully accredited university offering distant learning graduate degrees that focus on mind, body, and spirit. The topics that we cover here. We are particularly excited to announce new degrees emphasizing parapsychology and the paranormal. Visit their website at cihs.edu. You can now download a free PDF copy of issue number 8 of the New Thinking Aloud magazine or order a beautiful printed copy. Go to newthinkingaloud.org.
Thinking Aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with psychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
Hello and welcome. I'm Jeffrey Mishlove. Our topic today is Gnosticism, and my guest, Miguel Connor, is the host of the Aeon Byte Gnostic radio channel on YouTube and elsewhere. He is, in that capacity, the author of 2 books of interviews with leading scholars on the field of Gnosticism. In addition, he's written 4 novels. And on top of that, he was recently interviewed here on New Thinking Aloud about his newest book, The Occult Elvis, The Mystical and Magical Life of the King. And I'm going to link to that interview. If you haven't watched it, I think you'll enjoy it very much. So if you have a computer that can capture the link, it will be in the upper right-hand corner of your screen. Miguel lives in Illinois, near Chicago, I think. And now I'll switch over to the internet video. Welcome, Miguel. It is a pleasure to be with you today. Once again,
for the sequel. Glad to be here, and thanks for having me on, Jeffrey.
It's a pleasure. And in our previous interview, of course, we focused mostly on an American pop star icon, Elvis Presley. So we didn't really get into your, I guess it's fair to call it your primary interest of Gnosticism. And I'm really looking forward to digging into that today because I have many questions about Gnosticism. It's a confusing subject. So let's start with your definition. What is Gnosticism?
Yes, I think I can clarify a lot of the misconceptions as I've been doing this for so long. I was confused for years. I thought I was listening to jazz, like only I'll get it, or, it's different for everybody. But it is an experiential movement, which we must understand. But I would say Gnosticism is a tradition that really took hold in the Greco-Roman world in late antiquity. And it posits, in short, well, let me back up. I always like what scholar Stephen Davis said. Gnosticism is how God became human and how we can become God if we retrace the steps. You see that in Gnostic gospels like the Gospel of Thomas and so forth. It says the way of ascent is the way of descent. How we went back. And I sometimes say very in a cheeky way, it's more like how God went crazy and became us. I always think of that great South African film, The Gods Must Be Crazy, that probably only you and I in our generation knows about. But, and I always enjoyed what Bernardo Kastrup said, a mutual guest of ours. He always talked about how we're just disassociative parts of this giant mind. That's what the whole of creation is. And he always said, he always thought maybe this mind is in pain. It's trying to figure things out. That's why it spent the last 17 billion years exploring different things and finally became human to see if it can figure out or experience itself. But in short, Gnosticism posits that we live in a sort of simulation, perhaps illusion. They had different views. Some said that this was a prison a la Matrix. Others said this is more of a cosmic gym, place where we learn about ourselves, learn about our divinity, like Bernardo said. And we are trapped and we've forgotten our original astral home. That we are, like Bernardo, part of this cosmic mind, the ground of consciousness, that for different reasons broke up. Again, we can look at Jewish Gnosticism, the Kabbalah, and Isaac Luria and his idea of the first tree of life breaking and the sparks falling into creation. And the sparks have become us, and we've forgotten about that. Plus, we have become trapped by these stellar overlords, which the Gnostics often call the archons. The head of the archons had many names, but he's often referred to as the demiurge. And they associated him with the God of the Bible. However, some Gnostics associated him with Osiris and Zeus and Saturn and some of the other managerial creator gods. And these beings make sure that we stay asleep, ignorant of our true selves, that we share an essence with the supreme mind, this monad, the ground of consciousness, because they need our sparks, our divine sparks, as the Gnostics call them, to sustain this simulation, this software, this video game. And therefore, and they even feed off of this. We are their fuel, their energy. If some of your listeners or viewers are thinking of the Matrix, spot on. It's a modern Gnostic gospel retold again with sci-fi bells and whistles. So we are asleep, and this monad or supreme consciousness, God above God, as it's been referred to, will emanate these apostles of light to hand us down information to wake us up, plus these ecstatic rituals, shamanistic rituals, so that we can awaken and understand that we are trapped, we are worshiping the false gods, and we can rise through astral flights or inner knowledge to commune with the supreme being and wake up even more, gain these energies, come down and wake others up to eventually break down the simulation. And these apostles of light in Greco-Roman times were known as Jesus, Mary Magdalene, Sophia, Simon Magus. But some Gnostics would include Zoroaster and Buddha in these apostles of light, these people who help us wake up. So, and what the Gnostics used was a spiritual tech called Gnosis, which is a direct experience of divine forces to, again, wake us up and expand our consciousness. So that, in essence, is a brief explanation of Gnosticism. I should further say that it is, as scholars pretty much are agreeing more and more, it's an Egyptian religion. It is a descendant or a scion of the Egyptian mysteries. And it has other features, if you want to discuss, Jeffrey, like belief in reincarnation, support for a divine feminine figure, and other features that the Gnostics had, if you want to talk about those or wherever you want to go.
Well, this has been already very exciting. I've learned at least 2 new facts from you already, that Gnosticism is derived from Egypt. And here's one I had never heard before, that it's connected with the Kabbalah.
Mm-hmm. Yes, that's the great Gershom Scholem wrote a lot about how Kabbalah is Jewish Gnosticism. Very similar ideas. Instead of archons, you've got the Kelepoth. Instead of God going crazy, you've got the crashing of the Sephiroth. So the astral travels through the tree of life are similar to the Gnostic travels up into the heavens. And Egyptian, of course, remember the Egyptians thought we all have to travel to our afterlife, but there is this snake called Apophis. And so it's a dangerous thing, right? This is not simply I die and I'm happy. There's this giant serpent. The Gnostics sort of just replaced this evil chaos serpent with the demiurge and the archons.
How interesting that you should mention the serpent. I recently did an interview with a fellow you probably know, Danny Newman, who has written a book about the Native American Mississippian culture, their journey of the soul, their afterlife journey. And for example, in the state of Ohio, there is what is called the Serpent Mound. And Danny explained to me that that serpent is considered one of the dangers that the soul faces in its journey into the afterlife to reach the Milky Way.
Yeah, very true. It certainly parallels Gnosticism because, yes, they saw these evil, sometimes serpentine beings that could be dangerous. But at the other hand, they also saw the serpent as a holy figure. One of the characteristics of Gnosticism is really rewriting the book of Genesis, although they said we have the original meaning before the cult of Yahweh kind of pushed us aside. The Gnostics said we are also the original inheritors of the cult of Asherah, the ancient shamanistic Hebrew tradition. So they saw the serpent as actually a bringer of wisdom. And so often they associated the serpent in the garden with Jesus or Sophia. There were Gnostic sects who would have a serpent come out and they would give it offerings and kiss the serpent in the mouth. So the serpent archetype or power was it was very important to the Gnostics.
And I gather that throughout Gnosticism, and including not just the Judeo-Christian tradition, but others such as Manichaeism and Zoroastrianism, the struggle between the forces of good and evil, the great cosmic battle becomes significant.
Yeah, very true. Now, one thing to remember is the Gnostics were never just making stuff up. They weren't sitting in some pyramid in Egypt. Oh, we're going to create a new religion. They were very educated folks, and they saw what the other myths were telling them. And they came and they sort of dialed it up to 11. For example, the Gnostics saw the book of Enoch, which they quote, saying, these fallen angels have come in and have taken over the world and they're just botching things up. They saw the myths of the Anunnaki and these gods that are using us basically as farmers or slaves. They saw the myth of Prometheus, where Zeus creates man as a slave and Prometheus has to be this revealer for the Gnostics. They saw Zoroastrianism, where sometimes Ahriman will rule the earth for 1,000 years. They read the letters of Paul, where Paul is talking about the God of this world and powers and principalities. Paul uses the word rulers, which is Greek for archons, but he's talking about these spiritual beings, that spiritual wickedness in high places. So the Gnostics were seeing all these myths and saying, yes, we are really trapped. These beings that pretend to rule us don't have our best interest, and their slaves are our religions, our educational institutions, our political places. This whole place exists to keep us asleep, and we must find these even higher forces, this supreme intelligence, to awaken and understand how to break free.
It's really quite a scenario that's being presented to the Gnostics or to their flocks. But one can well imagine, since they seem to be saying that the powers that be in terms of earthly politics and, the religious and political institutions are imbued with a kind of evil.
For sure. Remember, when they really matured, this was a time when the Romans were ruling with an iron fist. And yes, the Romans gave us roads and all that, but it was a totalitarian system. And before that, you had other empires who ultimately oppressed, and they thought as above, so below. These are the heavens, and it's simply reflected down here on earth. So, and the word anarchist simply means no archons, and the Gnostics were known to be perhaps history's first anarchists. Well, Diogenes before probably was the first anarchist. I'll be honest with that, but they certainly were about rebellion. and about removing the old systems for something either older, more primordial and perennial, or something higher.
As a result of that rebellious attitude, I'm under the impression that throughout the world, in different cultures, the Gnostics were repressed.
Very much so. I mean, we're talking both religious and secular powers. Like you said, the Manichaeans went all the way to Asia. They were crushed. They were crushed in Persia. They were crushed in the Greco-Roman times. They were crushed by the rising Christian church throughout history. We see that with the Cathars, the Sufis as a sort of Gnostic Islam movement. We see it everywhere because for, again, the idea that you are individual, you are superior than God, the solution resides within you, beliefs and all these things don't work. You have to find your own, you have to find and awaken your own divine spark, find the rituals that work for you. The Gnostics were always very fragmented in lodges, trying different rituals for these ecstatic states of mind. So they were surprised. Also, the idea of a simulation, Jeffrey. In the East, it's no problem, right? Thousands of years, an illusion, Maya, simulation. But in the West, that it was never a popular concept for the most part. It's like, no, this is the world. This is fine. Everything is harmonious and everything is real. So the idea of a simulation really only came accepted in the West in the last 100 years because of science and math and all that. So the Gnostics were radical for daring to say that this was an illusion, a simulation. And for that, they were certainly punished, and for all their other beliefs as well.
Gnostics, though, were a very diverse group. You're already citing many different traditions, all the way from Kabbalah to the Manichaeans and
the
probably
Sufis.
and the Sufis. I never knew that the Sufis were thought to be Gnostics.
Yeah, that confused me for years, and thank God for the work of scholars like April DeConnick. We're seeing things the wrong way with the Gnostics. We think of them as a religion, and that's not what they are. As April DeConnick said, it's more of a metaphysical orientation, or as others said, it's a spiritual modality, like shamanism. The Gnostics have often been accused as being parasitical, especially by right-wingers and evangelicals and others, because they are, but they're not. It's a metaphysical orientation, like going back to shamanism. Shamanism exists in every culture, Mongolian, Peruvian, Tao, everything. It's a spiritual modality that offers certain solutions to certain people in a culture, like the Gnostics, traveling to the spirit world, healing, awakening. In fact, Gnosticism is probably a sort of Egyptian shamanism, if I would say. So therefore, it can attach itself to different religions and still be Gnostic. Again, you won't drive around and find a church of the shamanism, because it can't exist. Shamanism, by definition, has to be part of a wider culture and religious systems. Some have said the same thing with Buddhism, Jeffrey. They say, no, Buddhism is not a religion. It's a metaphysical orientation. That's why it exists in China and India and other places. It kind of appears within the culture and religious matrix of a people. So when you see Gnosticism that way, it makes sense how there can be an Islamic Gnosticism, a Jewish Gnosticism, a pagan, a Christian Gnosticism. It makes a lot more sense and solves a lot of problems. But the goal is still the same. Using that religion's exercises and spiritual tools to get that gnosis, that spiritual liberation, that altered state of mind, that ecstatic feeling, and using them. That's why the Gnostic seems to have all these varied practices, from entheogens to meditation to some did sex magic in Egypt because that was what was around, to contemplation. So that's why you see Gnostics having such a varied system of rituals and how they can appear in different religions.
I understand, too, that there are modern thinkers not identified with a particular religion, like the science fiction writer Philip Dick, who are thought to be Gnostics.
Very much so. I mean, Gnosticism was essential to Philip K. Dick, and a lot of it was his studying, but he had his famous 2374 experience when the veil lifted, the simulation lifted, and he realized we were still living in Roman times. The Romans were working for the archons. There was these secret Christians, and he was Thomas, the hero of the Gnostic saga, and we could awaken through the revelations of Valis and its pink beams to break down the empire, get out of the black iron prison. So Philip K. Dick was hugely influential, and there are other authors that most people don't know were very influenced by Gnosticism. William Blake, when you see his cosmology and his idea of Urizen and Noodaddy and the Zoas, you go, well, this is very Gnostic. He was influenced by Swedenborg, but somehow he tapped into Gnosticism. Robert Frost. Robert Frost has a poem called The Demiurge's Laughter, and his ideas of the two roads and others. You go, he is definitely influenced with Gnosticism. Cormac McCarthy, openly influenced by Gnosticism. And then, who wrote? Oh my God, I'm drawing a blank. Moby Dick. Herman Melville. Very influenced by Gnosticism, and he wrote a poem about the Cathars. And when you look at Moby Dick through a Gnostic lens, you see Moby Dick is the demiurge, and we're, part of his, it's our fight against this force of nature that rules the oceans.
Would you say that there was conflicts within different Gnostic sects?
Oh, yeah, definitely. I mean, one thing about the Gnostics is they did not mince words. You see it in their writings. They're slamming Christians, Jews, pagans, and other Gnostics. They had no problem. I mean, it was kind of part of their culture is, you debated, you challenge other people's ideas, and they definitely disagree. But because they were a small group and they broke off into lodges, it wasn't a problem. As again, April DeConnick said, you didn't like what your lodge said in Egypt, you went down the street or you went to Rome and you found something that worked for you. So yeah, there were certainly always conflicts and speculations on how evil the world was, how bad the demiurge was, the exact map of the cosmos and the astral realms to get to the god. Yeah, plenty of that with the Gnostics.
Well, there are certain texts which are considered to be primary sources of Gnosticism. Now, maybe that's just relative to certain scholars who emphasize those texts, but for example, the Gnostic Gospel of Thomas or Clement of Alexandria are considered primary. Would that be the case in your view?
Yeah, I mean, the Gnostics operated mainly out of Alexandria, so they were overlapping and rubbing shoulders with the Neoplatonists, with some of the Egyptian Christians like Clement. So there's a big overlap in ideas. Like Gnosis is not exclusive to the Gnostics. Christians use the term, pagans use the term. It was fine. So a lot of these ideas, I think Eric Davis calls them spiritual off-worlders. There was this group in Alexandria, and you could probably include the Merkabah Jews and others, Mithraism, this idea of leaving your body and traveling the stars and looking for star portals and going through those star portals. So it was there was certainly an overlap, and some of the texts, again, vary. I think the Gospel of Thomas comes more from the Syrian movement, the Thomasine mystical literature of there. Some have questioned if it's even Gnostic, but again, it's the Jesus of the Gospel of Thomas is very different from the Orthodox Jesus. This Jesus doesn't come to save you by his salvific death or to ransom the sins and all that. The Jesus in the Gospel of Thomas and the Gnostic text is there to awaken you, give you these teachings. That's what Jesus says in the Gospel of Thomas. If you can interpret these sayings, you will not taste death, meaning, ignorance, materiality, and all that. And you will be part of the living Father. You will be me. The Gnostics always thought We're not going to wait till the end of the world to be resurrected. We can be resurrected while we are in the flesh. The Gospel of Philip, another Gnostic text, said, you saw Christ, you became Christ. By emulating Jesus, we can become living Christ while we're still alive.
So I presume, and correct me if I'm wrong, that some of the authors of these Gnostic texts were actually officials rather highly placed within the church.
Some were, like Valentinus. He's considered perhaps one of history's first systemic philosophers. He operated in Rome, and he almost became Pope. I think he lost the Bishop of Rome vote. He came in second place, but he was certainly embedded. Again, the Gnostics had no problem embedding themselves into the church. He still believed in the Sophia and the Demiurge and becoming Christ and the world as a simulation, but he was certainly part of the church. And it used to infuriate the church fathers because they would go to his group and they'd say, are you a Christian? And they would simply nod their heads and say, yeah, and go into church. But then later during the week, they would meet secretly to do their sort of astral flight rituals. So again, the Gnostics had because again, it's a metaphysical orientation, they had no problem embedding themselves into the culture, into the church, into the neighborhoods that were around them.
The fact that you use the term lodges to describe the meetings of Gnostics, it's sort of, to me, reminiscent of the Masons. And I wonder if there's a connection between the Masonic movement and Gnosticism.
I think that Scott, that's a good question. I would say no, because the Masons believe in the grand architect, and the Gnostics believe that the architecture of the universe was terrible. It needed some work. It needed a little better help from other sources. But there's certainly a lot of the rituals, the Masonic ritual of dying and all that are similar to the Gnostics. The Gnostics, when you look at the rituals, and in fact, the church fathers said they were eerily similar to the mystery religions of those times, that tradition of dying to yourself and going down to Hades and then going up as a transformed being. So there is an overlap with the Freemasons and the Gnostics. I think more accurate would be Pythagoras. The Gnostics were called Neo-Pythagoreans by their detractors, and part of it with Pythagoras is you got a small group, and this group had one hierophant, and this person would teach this group and show them all these rituals. And obviously in Egypt, that became very popular because Pythagoras did go to Egypt and learn these systems where again, small groups, small people, very personal. Gnostics were usually vegetarian and all that. And I think that's more of the model which people have emulated throughout history, even today.
Well, you mentioned the Neoplatonists were in Alexandria right alongside the Gnostics. I gather that there were conflicts between them, that they didn't agree with each other.
No. Plotinus didn't have kind things to say about them. However, he did call them his friends. They were part of the universities. The Gnostics were very, again, logical, highly educated people besides being mystics. And Plotinus, in a lot of his work, seems to be answering the Gnostics. As scholar Dillard Burns said, he's countering a lot of these Gnostic texts while creating his theology. Some say he actually borrowed some of the Gnostic texts, which is normal. I mean, in those days, in real life, you kind of borrow, you adjust other people's ideas. But he did say that he didn't like the Gnostics slamming the world of the gods, even though Plotinus said, the body was evil. He didn't like the fact that the Gnostics thought that revelation or apocalypse was a viable form of a mystic experience. Plotinus thought living the life of a philosopher, contemplation, ethics was the way you could have a mystic experience. He thought the Gnostics were borrowing too much from Zoroaster and Oriental traditions. He didn't like that. So he certainly had a lot of disagreements with the Gnostics, but he certainly had no problem teaching them and hanging out with them at his university.
let's talk about Manichaeism, because that spread, I think, throughout much of the world, but it originated within Persia, in my understanding, and attracted at first the support of the Persian Empire and then the enmity of the Persian Empire.
Very much so. Yeah, Mani, I believe, was born in Mesopotamia under the rule of the Persians at the time. And he was part of an Elkasite movement, which is, again, pseudo-Gnostic, mystic Jewish kind of group. And he had certain visions as a young man, and he began to preach this sort of very Gnostic tradition, although he seemed to have leaned a little bit more on Zoroastrianism. In Mani's cosmology, there was the kingdom of light and the kingdom of darkness forever coexisting. And the kingdom of darkness attacks the kingdom of light. The kingdom of light sends this sacrificial, Adam Cadman or prime man. The kingdom of darkness devours him, and there's an explosion. And again, we have that the sparks fall into darkness. So the kingdom of light has to send these people, these apostles of light, because the sparks are us, and to awaken us. And that's, again, the Gnostics were never inventing stuff. They leaned on Zoroaster. But remember, there is a myth in the Orphic systems, why some people think the Gnostics came from the Orphic systems, where you've got baby Dionysus and the Titans attack him to devour him. And Zeus throws a bolt of lightning and kills the Titans, but Dionysus is there. So it falls into the world, and the universe is both Titan and Dionysus essence. And Zeus is like, we got to separate these. So Mani was from that tradition, and he was very successful. Again, like you said, the emperor of the Persian Empire thought this was going to be our new religion because it is peaceful, very eco-friendly. The Manichaeans were all about nature worship and vegetarianism and nonviolence, but they were also sophisticated in philosophy. They were mystics. So this emperor thought this would be a perfect idea as my empire grows. But he passed. His successor was in the control of the Orthodox Zoroastrian priests. So Mani was sentenced to death and brutally executed. But the movement continued all the way to Asia, and almost all the way to Spain. And it thrived in different places for about 1,000 years. Again, small lodges, spreading them out. The Manichaeans, like the Buddhists, believe you don't convert people. You plant the seed, the juju seeds, as the Buddhist says, and you plant the seeds and you walk away. Those who want to come to you can follow you through towns and kingdoms and all that. And as some said, it's possible, probably probable, that the Manichaeans then met a lot of the Catholics in the medieval times, and they converted to the Bogomils and then later to the Cathars, the famous Cathars of southern France. But then eventually the Manichaeans, as always, the persecution and the suppression and the censoring was too much and eventually just died out.
We're talking about very bloody persecutions, particularly the Cathars.
It was indeed. I mean, the Cathars lived in a wonderful place in southern France in the 13th century, 12th, 13th century, and they were known as the good Christians. That's one thing. The Gnostics, despite having this sort of Lovecraftian view of the world and the simulation and goth, they were always beloved. And, Plotinus enjoyed them. They were always seen as moral, upstanding citizens. So whether the Manichaeans, the Cathars were seen as just wonderful people to be around. The church, the Catholics around them really embraced them. It was a time when you also had troubadours, Kabbalists. It was an amazing place, but it was also a threat to the church. It was also a place with a lot of land and resources and money, a place because of the Cathars and the troubadours where women could become leaders and hold land, all the stuff that we can't have because we can't have independent thinking and everybody have agency. God forbid. So the church came down upon it. Most people don't know that the Inquisition started with the Cathars. It was created to destroy the Cathars. So it worked. Hundreds of thousands of people lost their lives. And then the Inquisition was like, you create a monster needs victims. So let's move on to Jews and witches. And the Inquisition just kept going.
Let's talk about what you have called Neo-Gnosticism. I recall in our last interview, you referred to yourself as a Neo-Gnostic.
More or less. I usually just call myself a heretic. That's the term heretic was invented in the context that we know today to deal with the Gnostics. It used to mean a school of thought or a speciality, but the early church was like, heretics are bad and these are the Gnostics. I think it works better. Plus, there is one, maybe two unbroken chains of Gnosticism from Greco-Roman times. One could be the Yazidi, and the other one is the Mandeans. Scholars are pushing back their creation. The Mandeans said we came from 1st century Jerusalem. Scholars think maybe 2nd century now. And they are the only unbroken line of these classical Gnostics. And Mandean means Gnostic. Mandeanism means Gnosticism. So out of respect for these poor people that have still being persecuted, even today, I mean, we've seen what Saddam and ISIS did to them in Iraq and other places, and just peaceful, loving mystics. Out of respect, I don't want to call myself a Gnostic because I feel that we still have living Gnostics today, as guarded as they are.
Would you say there is a neo-Gnostic movement? For example, I don't know if it's still being published, but there was the Gnostic magazine.
Great magazine. There is, and it has appeared throughout history, even after the Cathars were wiped out. It's appeared in literature through the writers I've shown you, even Philip Pullman and his Dark Materials, very based on Gnosticism. Carl Jung, extremely influenced by Gnosticism, his Red Book Visions. He had studied the Gnostic, but after his Red Book Visions, he realized this is just like Gnosticism, and he went to explore. And there are sects, I think, are neo-Gnostics. Some are good, some aren't very good, Jeffrey. And, your mileage may vary, but Heaven's Gate, I have to admit, Heaven's Gate was a neo-Gnostic movement. We're going to leave the flesh and go to this comet and ascend to a higher place. And this place is an evil simulation. Scientology certainly has a lot of Gnostic ideas that Xenu and we fell into the volcano and forgot our astral home and all this good stuff. And I think, as many have said, the Gnostics are almost like an ancient UFO cult, because they didn't just believe that we're going to travel the zodiac like Mithras and Neo-Platonism. They thought we're going through these portals like Virgo or Draco, and we're going to go to the final frontier. So a lot of these UFO cults and sci-fi cults definitely have a lot of Gnostic features. And you look at the work of David Icke, John Lamb Lash, and others who have kind of taken this guru role, and it's very Gnostic. In fact, they base themselves a lot on the Nag Hammadi library, that treasure trove of Gnostic texts that was found in 1945 in Upper Egypt. So there are sects that appear today that I would call neo-Gnostic, and they are directly mainlining Gnostic tradition, but giving it a more modern sci-fi UFO flavor, if you would.
When we talk about gnosis or direct revelation without the mediation of a community or a priesthood, that in itself would be threatening to various religious authorities. But then when you add the idea that the secular rulers are actually under the influence of evil archons, it creates, I would call it a revolutionary mentality amongst the Gnostics.
Yeah, and it's very mental. I mean, the Gnostics were always pacifists, but ideas are the most threatening thing to the powers that be. And again, they were looking at the Romans, they were looking at the Catholic Church and saying, this is wrong. There's something wrong with this place. They were looking at Jesus in the Bible when Satan says, I rule every kingdom in this world. And again, Paul, this idea that these powers and principalities were running the show. And I mean, we look today and we see politicians and we scratch our head and we go, why are you doing this? There's no logic. Sometimes there's no logical reason, Jeffrey. And you go, there has to be something pulling the strings, because this is making humanity worse. This is making our children less safe. And we go, and the Gnostics were saying this for centuries. It's like, what's going, at some point we got to bring in some supernatural reasons, right?
The counterpoint to that argument is that the challenges that we face in life, the hardships and the suffering that is imposed on us, is ultimately for our own benefit.
Some Gnostics would agree with that, like the Hermeticists, Valentinians. Others said, no, we got to break the system. We got to rage against the machine, as the saying says. But I think ultimately, it was all about waking up in ignorance. The Gospel of Philip, I think, nails the Gnostic idea. It says, the mother of all sin is ignorance. That's what the Gnostics hated. They thought that the opposite of good was ignorance. Any human being who becomes awakened, who becomes conscious, who realizes what the universe is about, that there are higher powers and the best parts of humanity, by default will become empathetic, will become kind, because it's kind of self-serving, right? We humans, when we work together and we care for each other, we are at our best. When we take care of nature, things work out. So the Gnostics were always, no, don't be ignorant, awaken, expand your consciousness, see the world for what it is, and then lean into it.
With regard to the idea that Gnosticism originated in Egypt, are there particular Egyptian sects that it goes back to?
The myth of a tomb, the original myth of a tomb, probably would be likely. This idea that there was once nothing, there was just, watery energy. The Gnostics are always using watery imagery when they're describing the heavenly realms. And this giant snake shifts into consciousness. Again, the Gnostics were obsessed with serpents and serpent motifs, whether they were bad serpents or good serpents. And then a tomb comes and he's lonely and he inseminates his own mouth and the gods come out. And in the myth, he becomes sad about existence and he starts crying. And we humans are the tears of a tomb. We're the sadness of God, which kind of makes sense, and so forth. So I think that the myth of a tomb and all that really coincides with what the Gnostics were doing, or what part of the Egyptian matrix they were doing. I mean, Isis certainly has a lot of characteristics with their goddess Sophia and Mary Magdalene. There's a lot of parallels to that. So, yeah, definitely. But it was always the mysteries, right? The inner work, the hidden parts of the Egyptian culture, the mystic part, which was dying out in the Greco-Roman world. And some scholars said it simply got repackaged as the Hermeticists, the Gnostics, and maybe the Neoplatonists.
In a way, all of these different traditions kind of became interpenetrating with each other. We talk about Hermeticism or the perennial philosophy or the Western esoteric tradition. It's kind of a mixture of Neoplatonism and Gnosticism and Kabbalah and alchemy and astrology is sort of all lumped together.
Yeah, well, I mean, think of Alexandria. That was the seat of knowledge, the library, the culture. The Buddhists were in Alexandria. So you have this wonderful stew in those days. So, of course, they're talking in the town squares and universities, and they're borrowing alchemical texts and all that. So, of course, there was a lot of hybridity and movement. And then later on, yeah, Alexandria falls, but then you have places like Baghdad and Florence. And again, these ideas are coming together: Gnosticism, alchemy, Hermeticism, and it continues through these places of knowledge and art and mysticism. So I don't know what it is today, Jeffrey. The internet? I don't know.
Miguel, what drew you to become such I would have to say, a scholar of Gnosticism?
Well, I was always a spiritual hitchhiker, as I like to say. I was raised Roman Catholic, but my mom was very ecumenical. My dad was a classic atheist. He was open to the idea of the world, but he just didn't care. He's like, don't talk to me until I die. so I was allowed, even as a young person, to explore, and I studied Hinduism. I went to ashrams, Buddhism. I tried different things, looking for the bigger answers in life, and also things that would work with my trauma. Gnosticism is about healing. It's shamanistic, and they talk about these exercises will heal your personal trauma, your cosmic trauma. What did Buddha say? As soon as the baby comes out, he cries because he's wise. Birth is a trauma, and the cosmic trauma of the universe falling apart. So these ideas really, I was looking for healing. I was looking for the answers of evil, what happens when we die, the usual stuff, and also what I felt was left out of Christianity. Again, the idea that the serpent was a good guy, that there was a divine feminine, that Jesus was more. There was a cosmic Christ, that reincarnation worked with Christianity. So all these questions I worked out personally for me, to each his own. I don't judge anybody's journey. It's your journey, but it worked for me. And I know it has holes in it, but every system has holes in it. And I like the idea that Gnosticism stresses it has to be experiential. You can have all this knowledge, but at the end of the day, you have to find a way to alter your state of mind and leave your egoic self. So all these things works for me with Gnosticism.
Well, you've been hosting the Aeon Byte radio program and interviewing people, I think, for about a decade. What do you think Gnosticism offers to modern people, to your listeners and viewers and readers?
Well, I hope they find their own path. That's what I always say. And I hope that they find that they do have a purpose, that the divine does reside within them, that they have so much potential that they can't even believe it. They can change the world. We can all change the world. And that they should ask questions, because the reality that has been given to us is not the true reality. Question everything, like people did in the 60s and 70s. Question your religions. Question your political systems. Don't accept. Don't get comfortable. Keep questioning, breaking down reality, and eventually the veils will lift and you will find a better reality that is more experiential. And again, find your purpose in this world. Become your own Christ, as the Gnostic Jesus says.
Well, Miguel Connor, this has been refreshing and enlightening. I've certainly learned quite a bit about Gnosticism. I didn't know, even though I've been curious about it for decades, actually. So thank you so much for being with me once again on New Thinking Aloud.
Oh, I always enjoy it, Jeffrey. Thanks for having me on.
And for those of you watching or listening, thank you for being with us, because you are the reason that we are here.
Book 3 in the New Thinking Aloud dialogue series is UFOs and UAP. Are We Really Alone? Now available on Amazon.
New Thinking Aloud is presented by the California Institute for Human Science, a fully accredited university offering distant learning graduate degrees that focus on mind, body, and spirit. The topics that we cover here. We are particularly excited to announce new degrees emphasizing parapsychology and the paranormal. Visit their website at cihs.edu. You can now download a free PDF copy of issue number 8 of the New Thinking Aloud magazine, or order a beautiful printed copy. Go to newthinkingaloud.org.